The ship that came out of hyperspace above Sereth Prime was the ugliest thing anyone in the Valhari Empire had ever seen. It was small, barely the size of a diplomatic shuttle, and its hull was covered in burn marks and patches of mismatched metal that told the story of a vessel that had been repaired too many times and replaced never. The Valhari warships that surrounded it were each 1,000 times its size, their hulls made of living crystal that glowed with the light of captured stars. And they looked at this little ship the way an ocean looks at a single drop of rain. "That is their envoy vessel?" Admiral Soreth asked, from the command deck of his flagship, and he could not keep the disbelief out of his voice. "It appears so, Admiral," his officer replied. "Scans show one life form aboard, no weapons beyond a basic point defense system, and an engine that runs on—" He paused and checked his display twice before continuing. "On controlled chemical." Admiral Soreth stared at the officer for a long moment, waiting for the correction that never came. "Escort it to the diplomatic port," he finally said, "and make sure no one laughs where the creature can hear it." Far below on the surface of Sereth Prime, in the throne room that sat at the top of the crystal spire, Princess Vinerith Kaelsora received the news of the envoy's arrival without any change in her expression. She was tall, even by Valhari standards, with skin like polished silver, and eyes that held the deep violet of dying stars. And she sat in her judgment chair with the kind of stillness that made lesser beings forget she was alive at all. For 300 cycles she had served as the gatekeeper of the ascendancy, the one who administered the right of proving to every species that came begging for recognition. And in all that time, not a single species had passed her trials. She had broken warlords who commanded fleets of 10,000 ships. She had shattered the confidence of hive minds that shared the thoughts of billions. She had made ancient beings who called themselves gods weep like children on the floor of her arena. And now they were sending her a human. She had read the initial file on the species, and it had taken her less than a minute, because there was almost nothing in it. A Class 9 primitive civilization from a small planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star on the very edge of known space. They had no telepathy, no natural armor, no energy manipulation, no hive link, no biological enhancements of any kind. They were soft, fragile, short-lived creatures who had only recently figured out how to leave their own planet. And the only reason they had been discovered at all was because a Valhari scout ship had stumbled across one of their primitive radio signals while passing through the region. The file concluded with a single recommendation: not worth formal evaluation. But the law was the law, and every species that petitioned the ascendancy was entitled to one chance at the right of proving. So Vinerith waited in her chair and prepared herself for what she expected would be the most boring afternoon of the last century. The human arrived at the throne room an hour later, escorted by 4 Valhari guards who each stood a full head taller than him. His name, according to the file, was Commander Ethan Rowe. He was not what Vinerith had expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected in the first place. He was shorter than the Valhari, and his body was wrapped in a simple dark uniform that carried no decorations except for a small patch on his shoulder that showed a blue and green circle. His planet, she assumed. His skin was a warm brown, weathered and marked with pale lines that she recognized as scars, and his hair was dark, but streaked with gray at the sides. Was his eyes that made her pause. They were not the eyes of a man walking into a room full of beings who could destroy his entire species with a single fleet command. They were calm and steady, and carried a weight to them that she had seen only in the oldest of the Valhari elders, the ones who had lived long enough to see stars die. He walked to the center of the throne room, and the entire court watched him with expressions that ranged from amusement to open contempt. A Valhari noble leaned toward his companion and whispered something about soft-skinned bipeds, and both of them laughed behind their hands. Ethan Rowe did not appear to notice, or if he did not appear to care. He stopped in the center of the room, looked up at Vinareth on her raised platform, and gave a single respectful nod of his head. He did not bow. He did not kneel. Every other envoy in the history of the Right had done one or both. "Ro," he said, and his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the vast chamber. "Representative of Earth and the United Human Territories, and I am here to petition for formal recognition under the laws of the Galactic Ascendancy." The court murmured at the simplicity of it. No titles, no flattery, no long speeches about the glory of the Velhari or the honor of being permitted to stand in their presence. Just a name and a purpose. Vinareth studied him the way she studied all her subjects, looking for the cracks, the fear, the weakness she would use to take him apart in the trials ahead. She found nothing. Not confidence, not arrogance, not bravery. Those she could work with, those she could break. What she found instead was something she had no name for. A kind of settled quietness. As if this man had already faced the worst thing he would ever face, and everything after it was simply a matter of showing up. "Requesting?" she asked, her voice cold and formal. "The right of proving consists of 5 trials administered by me personally, and no species has passed in over 300 cycles." "I understand," he said. "You understand that failure means your species will be denied recognition, and without recognition you will have no legal protection under galactic law." "I understand. And you have come alone, with no fleet, no guard, no delegation of any kind?" "I have." A ripple of laughter moved through the court. Vinareth did not laugh. She leaned forward slightly in her chair, and for reasons she could not explain, she felt the need to give this small, fragile creature one chance to walk away. "Commander Ro," she said, "I have tested beings with the power to crack moons and the minds to predict the movement of galaxies, and I have found every single one of them wanting. What makes you believe you will be any different?" Looked at her, and something shifted in those heavy, quiet eyes. "I do not believe I will be different, Your Highness," he said. "I simply believe it does not matter. When do we start?" The throne room went silent. Vinareth sat back in her chair and felt something stir inside her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. It was small and unfamiliar and slightly uncomfortable, like a muscle being used after years of stillness. It was curiosity. She raised one hand and signaled to her attendants. "Prepare the proving grounds," she said, and then she added, more quietly, so that only her closest advisor could hear, "And pull every piece of information we have on the species called human. I want to read it tonight." As Ethan Rowe was led from the throne room by the guards, he passed the 2 nobles who had laughed at him earlier. He did not look at them. He did not need to, because Commander Ethan Rowe had walked into places far more dangerous than this room, and he had walked out of all of them. And something about the way he moved, unhurried, unafraid, as if the weight of his entire world on his shoulders was something he had long ago learned to carry without complaint, made both nobles fall silent, and watch him go with expressions they did not fully understand. The doors closed behind him, and in her judgment chair high above the empty floor, Princess Vinareth Kaelsora realized that for the first time in 300 cycles, she was looking forward to the trials ahead. The proving grounds lay beneath the surface of Sereth Prime, carved into the bedrock of the planet over 10,000 cycles ago by Velhari engineers who believed that worthiness should be tested in the dark, far from the comfort of stars. The corridors were wide and cold and lit by a pale blue light that seemed to come from the stone itself. And as Ethan Rowe followed his escorts down into the depths, he could feel the weight of an entire civilization pressing down above him. He said nothing during the walk. The guards who had escorted hundreds of envoys before him found this unusual. Most species talked, some begged, A few threatened, and one particularly memorable insectoid ambassador had tried to eat one of them. But this human simply walked in silence, his eyes taking in every detail of the corridor, with the quiet attention of a man who had learned long ago that the space you are led into might also be the space you need to fight your way out of. First trial was the trial of mind. Princess Vinereth was already waiting when Ethan arrived at the chamber, standing beside a vast circular platform that hummed with energy and projected a three-dimensional map of an entire star system above it. "This is the lattice," she announced, her voice carrying the formal tone of someone who had given this speech many times. "It is a war simulation that maps the movement of fleets, resources, planetary defenses, and civilian populations across a system of 9 worlds. You will be given command of one faction, and you must achieve total strategic victory within one standard cycle." She paused and studied him, searching for the first signs of panic. "The simulation accounts for over 800,000 variables in real time," she continued. "Most species attempt to solve it through raw computational power or pattern recognition. The current record for completion is held by the Drexy Collective, a networked hive mind of 40 billion individuals, and it took them 6 attempts. And you are giving me one?" Ethan asked. "You will not need more than one," Vinereth said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite cruelty, but was very close to it. "Because you will not come close to finishing." Ethan stepped onto the platform, and the simulation activated around him. For the first 10 minutes, he did nothing but watch. The Velhari observers exchanged glances, because doing nothing was not a strategy they had ever recorded. Vinereth folded her arms and waited for the inevitable collapse. At the 15-minute mark, Ethan began issuing commands, but they were not the commands anyone expected. He was not attacking, not defending, not building forces or seizing territory. He was talking. He had found the communication channels within the simulation and was sending messages to the enemy factions, not threats or demands, but questions about their supply lines, their grievances, their territorial disputes with each other. And then he did something that made the lead Velhari tactical analyst choke on her drink. He offered one enemy faction the resources of another enemy faction in exchange for a ceasefire, then used the ceasefire to isolate the third faction, then negotiated a surrender from the third faction by promising them protection from the first. Within 40 minutes, the entire system was at peace and technically under his control, and he had not fired a single weapon. The simulation flashed green. Total strategic victory. The chamber was completely silent. "That is not how the lattice is meant to be solved," the tactical analyst whispered. Vinereth stared at the results for a long time, then turned to Ethan with an expression that betrayed nothing. "The trial of mind is complete," she said. "You passed, though your methods were unconventional." We call it diplomacy," Ethan said, and there might have been the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth, but it was gone before anyone could be sure. Vinereth did not smile back. "Prepare the gauntlet," she told her attendants, and her voice was a shade colder than before, because Princess Vinereth Kaelsora did not enjoy surprises, and this human had just given her one. The second trial was the trial of body, and it was designed to be the one where humans would certainly fail. The gauntlet was a 3-kilometer course through a series of chambers, each one calibrated to test a different aspect of physical endurance. There were gravity wells that increased the pull on the body to 3 times normal, chambers filled with atmospheric toxins that burned the lungs, rooms where the temperature shifted from extreme cold to extreme heat in seconds, and obstacles that required raw strength to overcome. It was designed for species with natural advantages. Thick hides, multiple hearts, redundant organ systems, exoskeletons, and the minimum physical rating required to even attempt it was a Class 4 on the galactic scale. Humans were rated Class 8. Vinereth almost felt sorry for him. Almost, but not quite, because feeling sorry for test subjects was something she had trained out of herself a very long time ago. Ethan entered the gauntlet without hesitation. For the first kilometer he moved well, better than expected, with a steady pace that suggested he had trained hard for something he knew would try to kill him. But by the halfway mark, his body began to fail. The gravity chamber forced him to his knees, and the observers could see the muscles in his legs shaking as they fought against a force they were never designed to handle. In the toxin chamber, he coughed blood, and the medical monitors showed his oxygen levels dropping to dangerous lows. In the heat room, his skin blistered, and in the cold room, his fingers turned white and stiff. The Velhari medical officer, watching the biometric feed, turned to Vinerith with alarm in her eyes. "Your Highness, his body is shutting down. Multiple system failures are beginning, and his core temperature is fluctuating beyond survivable range for his species. I recommend we end the trial." Vinerith opened her mouth to agree, because a dead envoy was a political complication she did not need. But then she looked at the monitor showing the inside of the gauntlet, and the words died in her throat. Ethan Rowe was still moving. He was not running. He could not run anymore, and he was not walking, because his legs had stopped fully cooperating about 200 meters back. He was crawling. His hands were leaving smears of red on the floor, because 2 of his fingers were broken, and the skin on his palms had torn open, and the sound of his breathing through the audio feed was a terrible, ragged thing. Hurt to listen to. But he was moving forward, centimeter by centimeter, dragging himself toward the finish line, with a stubbornness that the Velhari had no biological framework to understand. "What is happening to his body chemistry?" Vinerith asked the medical officer. The officer's voice was shaking when she answered. "His body is flooding itself with emergency chemicals, adrenaline, endorphins, cortisol, in concentrations that should have killed him 10 minutes ago. And his muscles are literally tearing themselves apart to keep contracting. His biology is, I do not know how to describe it, Your Highness. His body is destroying itself to keep him moving, and somehow he is letting it." Vinerith watched the screen without blinking. She had seen species with bodies made of living metal attempt this gauntlet. She had seen creatures with 4 hearts and bones made of carbon fiber attempt this gauntlet. None of them had bled like this and kept going. The human was not stronger than any of them. He was, by every measurable standard, weaker than all of them. But there was something in him that the others did not have, something that no biological scan could measure, and no galactic classification could account for. He refused to stop. Not because he could not feel the pain. She could see on the monitors that he felt every bit of it, but because something inside him had decided that stopping was not an option, and his body, broken and bleeding and failing, had simply obeyed. He crossed the finish line on his hands and knees and collapsed on the cold stone floor, and the medical team rushed in and surrounded him. Vinerith sat in her observation chair and realized that her hands were gripping the armrests so tightly that her silver skin had turned white at the knuckles. The medical officer approached her 20 minutes later with a report and a face full of confusion. "He will survive," she said, "though I cannot fully explain how. His species has a recovery ability that is remarkable, and he is already conscious and asking questions." "What questions?" Vinerith asked. The medical officer hesitated. "He is asking what the next trial is." Vinerith said nothing for a very long time. That night, alone in her quarters, she opened the intelligence file on humanity again, and began reading the sections she had skipped before. She found references to something called wars, not small conflicts, not territorial displays, not the ritual combat that most species engaged in, but vast, consuming, planet-wide wars that killed millions upon millions of their own kind. She read about a war they called World that happened not once, but twice. She read about weapons they had built that could turn cities into ash in a single flash of light. And she read that they had built these weapons, then used them on each other. And the thing that disturbed her most was not the violence itself, because the galaxy was full of violent species. What disturbed her was that after all of it, after the wars and the bombs and the millions of dead, they were still here. They had not destroyed themselves. Every model the Velhari had for species with this level of internal aggression predicted extinction within a few generations. But humans had broken every model, because they kept finding reasons to stop just short of the edge. She closed the file and stared at the ceiling of her quarters, and she thought about a broken man crawling across a stone floor with torn hands and shattered fingers, asking the doctor what came next. She did not sleep well that night. The third trial was the one Vinerith had always considered her masterpiece. The trial of will was not about strength or intelligence. It was about the thing that lived underneath both of those, the hidden architecture of a being's soul, the truth that no amount of training or preparation could disguise. It used a device the Velhari called the mirror, a telepathic intrusion system that reached into the mind of the subject and pulled their worst memories to the surface, forcing them to relive every failure, every shame, every moment of terror they had ever experienced, while the examiner watched and asked questions. The purpose was simple: to see what a being was made of when every wall was torn down and every mask was ripped away. Vinerith had personally administered this trial to over 400 envoys across 3 centuries, and every single one of them had broken. Some had screamed, some had begged. One had gone so deep into madness that he never came back, and his species had declared war on the Ascendancy, a war they lost in 6 days. The trial of will was Vinerith's domain, her art, her weapon, and she had never once met a mind she could not crack open like a shell. She entered the trial chamber and found Ethan Rowe already there, sitting on the stone bench in the center of the room, with his hands resting on his knees. His body was still wrapped in bandages from the gauntlet. The Velhari medical team had healed the worst of his injuries, but the bruises and cuts remained, and he moved with the careful slowness of a man whose body was held together more by will than by biology. "This trial is different from the others," Vinerith said, and she was closer to him now than she had been before, close enough to see the individual scars on his face and the way the gray in his hair caught the pale light of the chamber. "The mirror will enter your mind and bring your memories to the surface. Cannot resist it. You cannot hide from it, and you cannot lie while it is active. I will ask you questions, and if at any point you break, beg, or lose your composure, the trial is over, and you have failed." Ethan looked at her with those steady, heavy eyes. "And if I do not break?" he asked. "No one has ever not broken," she said. He nodded once, as if this was the answer he had expected, and said, "Go ahead." Vinerith activated the mirror and stepped into his mind. She had expected fragility. She had expected the thin, brittle shell of a short-lived species that had barely learned to walk among the stars, a mind she could shatter with a single well-placed memory. What she found instead was a landscape. It stretched in every direction, vast and heavy and scarred, like a field after a great fire, not empty, not dead, but marked by the kind of damage that changes the shape of the earth itself. She moved deeper, and the memories began to rise. She saw a city burning, not a simulation, not a distant report, but a real city on a real world, and the flames were so bright and so hot that even inside the memory she could feel them on her silver skin. She saw young Ethan Rowe, decades younger, with dark hair and no scars, and eyes that had not yet learned to carry weight, running through the streets with a weapon in one hand and a child in the other. She saw him hand the child to a woman and turn back toward the fire. She saw the building collapse. She saw him dig through the rubble with his bare hands, pulling out soldiers who had trusted him to keep them alive, some of them still breathing and some of them not, and she saw his face as he realized which ones were which. The memory shifted, and she saw a room full of men and women in uniforms, and Ethan was standing at a table covered in maps, and someone was asking him to make a decision. Decision even from inside the memory. A choice between two paths. One that would save a city of 200,000 people, and one that would save the 40 soldiers under his direct command. He chose the city. And then the memory showed her what happened to the 40 soldiers, and Vinerith wished it had not. She pulled back, shaken, and searched for another thread, expecting to find a wall, a door, some defense mechanism that would tell her where his breaking point was. There were no walls. Every door in his mind was open. He was not hiding anything from her. Not the guilt, not the grief, not the nightmares that she could feel lurking in the deeper layers of his consciousness, like fish beneath dark water. She pushed deeper and found more. She saw him standing in a graveyard, alone, reading names off stones. She saw him sitting in a dark room with a bottle in his hand, and a look on his face that she recognized, because she had seen it on. The faces of beings who had decided they were finished with living. She saw him put the bottle down. She saw him stand up. She saw him walk out of that room and into a hallway full of light, and she did not understand what had changed between one moment and the next. What possible force could have pulled a man back from that edge? But something had, and he had kept walking. She was deep inside his mind now, deeper than she had ever gone with any subject, and the sheer volume of pain in this man's history was staggering. Not because any single event was worse than what other species had endured, but because there was so much of it, layer after layer, year after year, and through all of it, he had remained standing. She felt him become aware of her presence, not fighting her, not pushing back, but simply acknowledging that she was there, the way a man might acknowledge a visitor in his home. And then she heard his voice, not from the outside, but from within the memory itself, and he was speaking directly to her. "You want to see if I will break?" he said. And his voice was calm and tired, and carried the weight of every memory she had just walked through. "I broke a long time ago. I just learned to carry the pieces." Vinerith pulled out of the mirror so fast that the technicians monitoring the device jumped in alarm. She was standing in the trial chamber again, breathing harder than she wanted to admit, and Ethan Rowe was sitting on the stone bench, looking at her with an expression that held no anger, no accusation, no triumph, just a quiet understanding, as if he knew exactly what she had seen and did not blame her for seeing it. "The trial of will is complete," she announced to the chamber, and her voice was steady, because she had spent 3 centuries learning how to make her voice steady even when the rest of her was not. The subject passed adequately. She turned and left the chamber without another word, and the court observers noted that the princess walked faster than usual and did not stop to speak with anyone. In her quarters that night, Vinerith opened the full intelligence file on humanity. Not the summary, not the overview, but everything. Every scrap of data the Velhari scouts and analysts had gathered about this species from the edge of known space. And she read it all. She read about a battle at a narrow pass, where 300 human soldiers held their ground against an army of hundreds of thousands, knowing they would die, choosing to die so that others could live. She read about a ship called the Titanic that struck ice in a frozen ocean and sank, and the musicians aboard who kept playing their instruments as the water rose around them, because they believed the music would bring comfort to the people who were afraid. She read about doctors who had injected themselves with diseases they were trying to cure, gambling their own lives on the chance that they might save millions of strangers. She read about a man named Vasily Arkhipov, who had single-handedly prevented a war that would have burned the entire surface of the human planet, and who had done it not with a weapon or a fleet or a grand gesture, but by simply saying no when everyone around him was saying yes. She read about the human concept of sacrifice, not the ritual kind that the Velhari practiced, the careful, calculated exchange of something lesser for something greater, but the raw, irrational, terrifying kind. The kind where a person throws their body over a grenade to save people they have known for less than a year. The kind where a mother runs into a burning building because her child is inside, and the math does not matter. Something inside Vinerith shifted, like a tectonic plate moving deep beneath the surface of a world. Too deep to see, but powerful enough to change the shape of everything above it. File and sat in silence for a long time. Then she stood and walked to the envoy quarters on the far side of the spire, past her guards, and past the protocol officers who called after her in confusion, and she pressed the signal at Ethan Rowe's door. He opened it, still bandaged, still bruised, and if he was surprised to see the princess standing in his doorway in the middle of the night cycle, he did not show it. She sat across from him in the small room, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then she asked a question that no Velhari royal had ever asked an envoy in the entire history of the Rite of Proving. "Why did they send you?" she said, and her voice was quiet now, stripped of its formal coldness. "Of all your kind, of all the generals and leaders and politicians your species must have, why you?" Ethan looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that was not weight, or calm, or sadness, but something warmer. "Because I volunteered," he said. Vinerith stared at him. "No one ordered you to come here." "No." "No one promised you anything in return." "No." "Then why?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice was the voice of a man who had thought about this question for a very long time. "Because someone had to," he said, "and I have spent my whole life being the someone who does." Vinerith left his quarters without another word, and she walked back through the corridors of the crystal spire with a feeling in her chest that she had not experienced in 300 years. She did not know what to call it yet, but it felt dangerously close to respect. The grand arena of Serath Prime had not been filled to capacity in over a century. It was a vast open structure at the heart of the capital, built from the same living crystal as the rest of the city, and its seats rose in sweeping tiers that could hold representatives from every species in the ascendancy. Today, every seat was full. Word had spread through the empire like fire through dry grass. The human envoy had passed 3 trials, something no species had done in 300 cycles. And now the 4th trial was about to begin. The trial of blood. Combat. Representatives from the Drexy Collective, the Morvathi Hegemony, the Silken Courts of Athari, and dozens of other species had come to watch, some out of curiosity, and some out of the simple desire to see a human bleed. The Emperor himself was present, seated in the royal box high above the arena floor, his expression carved from stone, and his violet eyes revealing nothing. Him sat Vinerith, and for the first time in her life, she was not entirely sure what she wanted to happen next. The Velhari champion entered the arena first. His name was Korath Ven, and he was everything that Velhari biology could produce when it was pointed toward violence. Nearly 3 meters tall, with skin that had been hardened through genetic enhancement until it was stronger than most ship-grade alloys, and reflexes that operated 3 times faster than any human nervous system could manage. He carried a staff weapon made of condensed energy that hummed with a sound like a distant storm, and he moved with the fluid grace of a predator who had never once in his life doubted that he was the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. The crowd cheered for him, because Korath Ven was a hero of the Empire, and he had fought in 17 real engagements and won every single one without suffering a serious injury. Then Ethan Rowe walked onto the arena floor, and the cheering faded into something closer to uncomfortable silence. He was still healing, Anyone could see that, and he moved with the stiffness of a body that had been pushed past its limits and was only partway back. He wore no armor beyond a basic protective suit, and the weapon he carried was not a Velhari energy construct or a plasma lance, or any of the advanced combat tools that other species brought to the trial of blood. It was a blade, a simple steel blade, forged on Earth, with a leather-wrapped handle and an edge that caught the arena light and threw it back in a thin white line. A Velhari noble in the front row turned to his companion and said, "Is that a knife?" "I believe it is a sword," his companion replied. "What is the difference?" "I think about 300 centimeters. Vinerith did not find this funny. She had seen the inside of Ethan Rowe's mind, and she knew what those scarred hands were capable of. And she knew something else that the laughing nobles did not. She knew that this man had survived things that would have killed most beings in this arena, and he had done it not because he was stronger, but because he simply did not know how to stop. The trial began. Korath then attacked first, as Velhari champions always did, driving forward with his energy staff in a series of strikes so fast that the human should not have been able to see them, let alone react to them. But Ethan moved. Not fast. He was nowhere near fast enough, but smart, shifting his weight at the last moment, turning his body so that the strikes that should have hit him full on instead grazed past, or struck at angles where his suit could absorb the worst of it. Still, the first exchange ended with Ethan on the ground, a deep burn across his left arm, and Korath standing over him, without a scratch. The crowd roared. Ethan got up. Korath caught him with a sweeping blow to the ribs that lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing into the arena wall, hard enough to crack the crystal behind him. Blood, red, alien, startling, splattered across the white floor, and the crowd went quiet for a moment, because most of them had never seen blood that color before. Ethan got up. The third exchange, and the fourth, and the fifth, each one ended the same way, with the human on the floor and the Velhari champion standing over him. And each time, the crowd expected it to be the last. Each time, Ethan got up. And each time he got up, something was different. Vinerith saw it before anyone else did, because she was watching with the eyes of someone who had studied combat for 300 years, and what she saw made her grip the armrest of her chair. He was learning. Every time Korath knocked him down, Ethan came back up with new information. Champion's footwork. Identified another tell in his grip. Found another gap in the rhythm of his attacks. He was using his own body as a laboratory, letting himself be hit so that he could study the thing that was hitting him. And the price he was paying in blood and pain was a price he had apparently decided he could afford. By the seventh exchange, Korath's strikes were landing less cleanly. By the ninth, Ethan was dodging blows that should have been impossible for his reaction speed to handle. Not because he had gotten faster, but because he had learned where the blows would be before they arrived. Korath then, for the first time in 17 engagements, felt something he did not recognize. It took him a moment to identify it. It was uncertainty. The 10th exchange was the last. Korath committed to a massive overhead strike designed to end the fight in a single blow, and Ethan did something that no tactical analyst in the arena could explain afterward. He stepped into the blow, not away from it, not to the side, but directly into it, taking the full force of the energy staff across his shoulder, with a sound that made half the audience flinch. His collarbone shattered. The medical monitors confirmed it instantly, and his left arm went limp at his side. But the step had carried him inside the reach of Korath's weapon, inside the champion's guard, into the one place a staff fighter never wants an opponent to be. And in the half-second it took Korath to realize what had happened, Ethan Rowe brought his steel blade up with his one working arm, and pressed it against the Velhari champion's throat. The arena went completely silent. 10,000 beings from 100 different species stared at the floor below, and none of them made a sound. The medical displays showed Ethan's vitals in stark detail. Broken collarbone, 3 cracked ribs, internal bleeding, a concussion, blood loss that was approaching critical levels. He was standing, through sheer force of something that the Velhari medical team would later describe in their report as an unclassifiable psychological override of biological shutdown protocols. He was standing because he had decided to stand, and his body, broken as it was, had obeyed. Korath then looked down at the blade against his throat, and then looked into the eyes of the human holding it. And then Ethan did something that no one expected. He lowered the blade, stepped back, and bowed. A deep, respectful bow, the kind given between equals, between warriors who have tested each other and found each other worthy. The arena did not know how to respond, because in the entire history of the Trial of Blood, no one had ever shown respect to their opponent, least of all a winner to a loser. Korath then stared at the human for a long, silent moment. Then the Velhari champion did something he had never done before. He returned the bow. The arena erupted, not in cheers exactly, but in something more confused and more powerful. A sound that carried shock and disbelief, and something that might have been the first stirrings of admiration. In the royal box, the Emperor turned to Vinerith, and his face was not pleased. "Come to my chambers after the arena clears," he said, and his voice was the voice of a ruler who saw a threat forming on the horizon and intended to crush it before it could grow. Vinerith bowed her head and said nothing. 1 hour later she stood before her father in his private chamber, a room of dark crystal and cold light where the most important decisions in the ascendancy were made. "You will administer the trial of soul," the Emperor said, "and you will ensure that he fails." Vinerith looked at her father, and for the first time in her life, she did not immediately say yes. The trial of soul is a judgment of truth. "Father," she said carefully, "it cannot be rigged. The ancient laws are clear." "The ancient laws give you sole authority to determine the question and evaluate the answer," the Emperor replied. "There is always a question that has no correct answer. Find it, and use it." He leaned forward, and his eyes were hard. "This species is dangerous, Vinerith, not because they are strong, but because they make other species believe that strength is not what matters. That is a threat to everything we have built, and I will not allow it to stand." Vinerith bowed and left the chamber. That night, she accessed the deepest classified files on humanity, files that even she had not been given clearance to read until now. And there she found the truth about Commander Ethan Rowe. He was not just a soldier. He was the man who had ended humanity's last great war, a conflict called the Dissolution that had split the human species into 3 factions, brought them to the very edge of extinction. He had walked unarmed into enemy territory to negotiate peace, not once, but 3 times. The first time he was shot. The second time he was captured and tortured for 11 days. And the third time he walked in with the scars of the first 2 visits still fresh on his body, and refused to leave until both sides agreed to talk. He had brokered the Sol Accords, the treaty that reunified humanity and saved their species. He was the most decorated, most wounded, and most respected human alive, and Earth had not sent a diplomat or a politician or a general to represent them before the ascendancy. They had sent the one person who had already saved their entire species once before. Vinerith sat alone, in the dark of her quarters, and whispered to herself words that no one else would ever hear. "They did not send an envoy," she said. "They sent a legend." She looked at the notes she had prepared for the trial of soul, the impossible question her father had ordered her to construct, the trap designed to ensure that humanity would fail. She looked at it for a very long time, and then she made a decision that would change the galaxy. The Soul Chamber was the oldest room on Serath Prime. It existed before the Crystal Spire, before the capital city, before the Ascendancy itself, carved into the living rock of the planet by hands that no one remembered, in an age so distant that even the Velhari had lost count of the years. The walls were rough and unpolished, nothing like the elegant crystal of the world above, and the only light came from a single pale flame that burned in the center of the chamber, without fuel or heat. A flame that had been burning since before the first Velhari drew breath. This was where the trial of soul was conducted. There were no weapons here, no simulations, no devices, just the flame, the stone, and two beings facing each other across the oldest question in the galaxy. Is your species worthy? The chamber was silent, but it was not empty. Hidden projectors carried the image and sound of everything that happened here to every screen in the Ascendancy. And today, the entire galaxy was watching. In the royal box above the arena, the Emperor sat with his hands folded, and his expression set in the cold certainty of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. In chambers and halls and ships across 1,000 worlds, representatives of every species in known space held their breath. And in the Soul Chamber, Princess Vinerith Kaelsora stood on one side of the pale flame and watched Commander Ethan Rowe walk in from the other. He looked terrible. The medical team had done what they could, but the human body heals slowly by galactic standards, and the evidence of 4 trials was written across him in bruises and bandages, and the careful way he held his left arm against his broken collarbone. He should not have been standing. By every medical metric available, he should have been in a recovery bed, sedated and immobile, letting his biology do the slow and painful work of putting itself back together. But he was standing, because there was one trial left, and he had not come across the galaxy to stop now. He took his place across the flame from Vinerith, and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them was a princess or an envoy. They were just 2 people who had been through something together that neither of them fully understood. The trial of soul is the final and most sacred trial of the rite of proving, Vinerith said, and her voice echoed in the stone chamber with a weight that 300 years of authority had given it. I will ask you one question, and your answer will determine the fate of your species. There is no correct answer, there is only a true one. Ethan nodded. The chamber waited. Vinerith looked at him across the flame, at the bruises and the blood, and the gray hair and the steady, heavy eyes that had seen more than any being in this chamber could imagine. Question. P. Why should your species be allowed to stand among the stars? P. The words hung in the air like smoke. In the viewing halls across the Ascendancy, 100 species leaned forward. Every envoy who had ever stood where Ethan was standing had answered this question with arguments: military strength, technological achievement, economic value, strategic alliances, cultural contributions. And Vinerith had weighed every answer and found every one of them wanting, because any argument for worthiness can be dismantled by someone clever enough. And Vinerith was very, very clever. Ethan was quiet for a long time. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, and then it stretched further until it became something else entirely. Not empty, but full, the way a breath is full just before a person speaks the truest thing they know. We should not, he said. The chamber rippled with shock, a sound that started in the Soul Chamber and radiated outward through every screen in the galaxy, a collective intake of breath from 1,000 worlds. Vinerith's eyes widened, and she said nothing, because this was not any answer she had prepared for. We are fragile, Ethan continued, and his voice was steady and quiet, and carried the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime thinking about exactly this question. We are short-lived, Our bodies break easily and heal slowly, and we carry no natural weapons or defenses of any kind. We fight each other as much as we fight anything else. We have burned our own cities and poisoned our own rivers and killed our own children in wars that we started over things that we had already forgotten by the time the killing stopped. We break, we fail, and we repeat our worst mistakes across generations. And by every metric you use to measure the worth of a species, we do not qualify. The chamber was so silent that the sound of the pale flame seemed enormous. Ethan looked at Vinarith across the fire, and his eyes held something that was not desperation and not pleading, but something deeper, something honest, something raw, something that had no armor over it at all. "But we are here anyway," he said. "Not because we are the strongest, or the smartest, or the most worthy. We are here because a species that has every reason to destroy itself chose not to. Every single day, we choose not to. We wake up on a world that we have scarred and polluted, and nearly burned to nothing more times than I can count, and we choose to plant seeds in the ash. We choose to rebuild the cities we knocked down. We choose to teach our children to be better than we were, even though we know they will make their own mistakes just as bad as ours. And that choice, made by imperfect, terrified, stubborn people who know exactly how dark things can get because they have been there and they carry the scars to prove it. That is not a weakness." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was not louder, but it was somehow more present, as if the words were coming from a place deeper than his throat. "That is the most powerful thing in your galaxy, and you have never seen anything like it." The pale flame flickered. The soul chamber was silent. Across the ascendancy, on 1,000 worlds, no one spoke. Vinarith stood on her side of the flame and felt something moving inside her chest. Not the curiosity she had felt on the first day, not the respect she had felt after the third trial, but something bigger, something that had roots and weight, and the terrible momentum of a truth that cannot be unfelt once it has been felt. She looked at Ethan Rowe, broken, bleeding, standing on nothing but will and honesty. And she looked at the 300 years of envoys she had crushed, the thousands of species she had measured and found wanting, had served her entire life. And she made her choice. She stepped down from the judge's platform. The court observers gasped, because the judge never left the platform during the trial of soul. Never, not once in the entire recorded history of the rite. She walked across the stone floor, past the pale flame, and she stood beside Ethan Rowe, not above him, not in judgment of him, beside him. She turned to face the projection that carried her image to her father, and to every being in the ascendancy, and she spoke. "The rite of proving is complete," she said, and her voice was clear and strong, and carried an authority that did not come from her title or her crown, but from something she had just discovered inside herself. "Humanity passes, not by my mercy, but by a standard this court has forgotten." She paused, and when she continued, her words were aimed not at the Emperor, but at the galaxy. "We have measured every species by what they are, by their strength, their technology, their power, their biology, and we never once thought to measure one by what it chose to become. Humanity is not great because of what they have. They are great because of what they do with what little they were given, and because they choose every single day, in the face of every possible reason not to keep going. That is not a lesser form of worthiness. It is the highest, and we have been too proud to see it." The soul chamber was silent. The galaxy was silent. And then, from somewhere in the viewing halls of Seraph Prime, a single pair of hands began to clap. Later records would show it was a Drexy delegate, a member of the hive mind species that had failed the rite 12 cycles ago. And the sound spread, slowly at first, and then faster, until the clapping became a roar that shook the crystal spire to its foundations. The Emperor sat in his box with a face like carved ice and said nothing, because The ancient laws were clear. The trial of soul was the princess's judgment to make, and she had made it, and not even an emperor could overrule the right. Humanity was recognized. Earth was protected. The ascendancy would never be the same. Later, after the ceremonies and the formal declarations, and the endless flood of diplomatic messages from species who suddenly wanted to talk to this small, fragile, impossible race from the edge of known space, Vinerith walked Ethan Rowe to the docking port where his battered ship waited. The corridor was empty. She had made sure of that. And for a while, they walked in silence. Then she stopped and turned to him, and her voice was stripped of everything official and everything royal. And what was left was just a person speaking to another person. "I have judged 10,000 souls in that chamber," she said. "Warlords, kings, hive minds, beings who called themselves gods, you are the first one who made me judge myself." "Then it was worth it," he said. He turned and walked toward the airlock of the Long Walk. And just before he stepped through, he looked back one last time. "Your Highness," he said, "you did not let us pass because we impressed you. You let us pass because you saw something in us that you wish your own people still had. Do not lose that feeling, because the galaxy is going to need it." The airlock closed. The Long Walk undocked from Sereth Prime with a shudder and a groan that made the docking crew wince, and its patched and battered hull turned slowly toward a distant yellow star that the Velhari maps now marked with a new designation: Sol, homeworld of a recognized species. Vinerith stood at the observation deck and watched the ship until it was nothing but a speck against the black. The intelligence file on humanity one last time. She scrolled past the wars, past the weapons, past the famines and the plagues, and the endless catalog of ways this species had tried to destroy itself. She stopped on an image she had overlooked before. It was a photograph, old and faded by human standards, showing a single figure standing in a field of gray ash, the aftermath of something terrible, something that had burned away everything that had been there before. The figure was planting a tree, a small, green, living thing, pressed into dead ground by hands that had no reason to believe it would ever grow. Below the image was a caption in a human language that she could now read. "A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they shall never sit." Vinerith closed the file. She stood alone on the observation deck of the Crystal Spire, surrounded by the light of 1,000 stars and the weight of an empire that was already beginning to change. And she thought about a broken man who had crawled across a stone floor, who had opened every door in his mind without fear, who had bowed to the warrior who tried to kill him, and who had answered the most important question in the galaxy with the most honest answer she had ever heard. And for the first time in 300 years, Princess Vinerith Kale Sora smiled. Not the cold, measured smile of a royal, not the satisfied smile of a judge, a real smile, small and warm and human in a way that would have surprised her if she had seen it. And far away, growing smaller with every passing second, the Long Walk carried its single passenger home, a tired, scarred, stubborn man who had done what he always did. He had shown up, he had told the truth, and he had refused to stop. And the galaxy would never be the same.